Is the US national debt really as catastrophic as it sounds? Or could the threats to the dollar be overblown? Let's unpack the facts and see if we're truly on the brink of financial disaster. Today, we're talking about the ominous predictions surrounding the US national debt and its impact on the dollar. We constantly hear that the mounting debt is set to obliterate the dollar's value, but is it really that simple? Could this narrative be overhyped or even misconstrued? In this video, we'll delve into both sides of the argument, scrutinizing the data and the opinions that are out there. We'll explore whether the dollar is genuinely teetering on the edge due to debt levels, or if there are other significant factors at play. Stick around as we dissect these concerns and offer insights on what you really need to know about the health of the dollar and the US economy. Let's get into it and separate the speculation from reality. But before we get into it, my name's Nolan Matthias, and if you want the truth about the dollar, if you want the truth about personal finance, if you want the truth about what's really happening in global economics, this is the place for you. So at the end of this video, if you found it insightful, if you found it useful, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's discuss the US debt crisis and the real risk to the US dollar. And like I said at the beginning, if you can't handle the truth about what's actually happening with the US economy and the US dollar, then it's probably a good idea to just click off this video and go watch something else. Okay, so now that we've gotten rid of everybody who definitely thinks that the US economy is going to collapse and is just dead set on the fact that this is going to be bad, let's talk about the realities. And the reality is there is a problem here. There is a reality with the US national debt. But is it as big of a problem as many pundits would have you believe? Well, the reality is yes and no. But it isn't quite at the point where it's going to be catastrophic yet. And I'll show you why in a couple of minutes here. But let's start this conversation by talking about the realities of the national debt. It is now $35 trillion. It is the highest it has ever been. And the debt to GDP ratio is around 125%. So the numbers are quite alarming. And they should be alarming. In fact, the number one thing that politicians right now should be concerned with is the US national debt. There's no doubt about that, because right now, immediately, things need to start changing. But there are some potential things that they can do in order to mitigate the risk of the US national debt. Now, it's important to understand the mechanisms of the national debt and how it got to where it is right now, because there are some outlier events that have happened in essentially the last 10 to 15 years that have created a problem that is one that didn't exist prior to 2008. And in this video, I'm going to go through and I'm going to discuss several things. I'm going to discuss the current state of the US national debt. I'm going to discuss the reasons for the steep increases, and then we're going to take a look at the arguments from both sides. Is this catastrophic? Is it not? And then we're going to talk about how the US can solve the debt problem, because yes, the US has been here before. We have seen debt to GDP ratios that are pretty much the same as what they are now, and there was a solution to that. The US did in fact come out of those very dire times. And then last but not least, we're going to talk about what you need to be doing right now with your personal finances to mitigate the risk. And don't sleep on this, because just because I'm going to paint the picture that this may not be the absolute worst problem possible, there is some things you need to do to protect yourself in case it does become worse. And yes, there are some things that could happen that could quickly see the debt to GDP numbers get even worse than what they are right now. So let's start by understanding where we're at. As of 2024, the US national debt now exceeds $35 trillion, and it is increasing at a significant rate to the tune of about $2 trillion per year. Now, in the past, like I said earlier, the US has managed high debt levels before, and there's multiple key factors that have led us to the position that we're in right now. One of the primary ones is government spending on defense, being basically the globe's police force. There's healthcare and social security, and there's the tax cuts that are often deemed to be, well, in the best interest of the US economy, but often aren't. And then on top of that, there is significant economic stimulus packages that came along with the 2008 financial crisis, as well as the pandemic. And it's important to note that a significant amount of the increase in the US national debt came from two significant problems: the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic. And in both of these scenarios, significant things had to be done to prevent us from ending up in a scenario that could have been significantly worse than what it was, and what many will have you believe is coming down the road. And these spending packages, the amount of money that was injected into the economy, were necessary investments. And yes, they were investments to save the economy, similar to the significant investments that were made during World War II that allowed the US to actually fight that war and ultimately win it. And if we take a look at the US national debt, what you can see is that this isn't the first time we've been at debt to GDP ratios similar to what they are now. In fact, coming out of World War II, the numbers were very, very similar. Now, the question is, what led the US to get out of that debt crisis? Well, the answer to that was productivity. I'm going to explain a little bit later on some things that are coming down the road that are very much in the favor of the US when it comes to productivity. And they have a lot to do with technological advances. But before I get into that, there are some significant factors that could lead to a possible collapse. The first and probably the worst would be hyperinflation. The second would be a loss of confidence in the US dollar, which seems to be something that is starting to happen. The third would be political deadlock. So, in other words, the US government not negotiating to increase the debt ceiling at some point, or some sort of other conflict that led the political system to essentially put the US economy in a very precarious place. And then last but not least, rising interest rates, because high debt levels can result in increased interest rate expenses, and that makes borrowing more expensive for governments. And we're seeing that right now. We have higher interest rates, which means that the debt is increasing at a significantly higher rate because the interest rates are higher, and therefore the cost to service the debt are higher. Now, any of these things individually may not be a particularly dire issue, but if we're to see multiple of these things start to rear their ugly heads at the same time, we could find ourselves in a situation where, yes, the dollar could collapse. But there are some arguments as to why that may not happen or why that shouldn't happen. Now, before I get into those, though, I want to talk about the historical precedents, because this is something that is often talked about in the media, on YouTube. And yes, there are all of these countries that in the past have found themselves in a debt problem that has led to the collapse of the currencies for those respective countries. But there's some major differences between those countries and the United States. Look at Zimbabwe, for example. Multiple occurrences of hyperinflation due to excessive printing of money that led to the collapse of the Zimbabwe currency. But unlike the US, which, believe it or not, actually has prudent monetary policies and checks and balances, the Zimbabwe government just simply started printing money to try to get themselves out of debt. And comparing Zimbabwe to a place like the US is the equivalent of comparing a horse and buggy to a modern F-350, a high-performance truck with all of the power and all the tools that you need in order to get the job done. And no, this video isn't sponsored by Ford, but you get the idea. Horse and carriage versus a modern pickup truck are two completely different things. And that's what we're comparing when we look at places like Zimbabwe, or for that matter, Venezuela, which had these similar sorts of issues that Zimbabwe had, combined with a whole bunch of other things that absolutely led to a crisis there, including the collapse in oil prices and just straight up economic mismanagement from a dictator. Now, the closest thing that we could possibly compare the US to in modern history would be Germany. But obviously, a lot of the things that happened with respect to Germany came from reparations that had to be repaid after the respective wars. And barring a major world war where the US ended up being on the losing side, the likelihood of finding ourselves in a similar situation is low to none. And the other big thing that you have to keep in mind here is that the US has a diversified economy. It has strong institutions, and the dollar serves as the world's reserve currency. Now, even though its role as a reserve currency isn't enough to prevent it from collapsing, the fact that many other countries, including places like China, Japan, and most other modern economies, carry a significant amount of their reserves in the US dollar, which means that most of those countries have a vested interest in not seeing the US dollar collapse. So even as things happen like the BRICS nations organizing, well, most of those nations still have a very, very strong interest in seeing that the US dollar does not, in fact, collapse. And on top of that, even though there were those major bailout packages from 2008 and 2020 when the pandemic hit, the US has actually gone to great lengths to start to reduce the money supply. Now, one of the things that is most quoted when it comes to the US national debt was the excessive money printing and the increase in the money supply. And you can see it here in 2008, and then again in 2020, significant increases to the amount of US dollars that were available on the market. But what many people don't discuss is the fact that the US Federal Reserve has actually gone to great lengths to reduce the amount of money, the M2 money supply available in the economy over the last several years. And if you were to take a look at this chart and you were to put a trend line, what you can see is that as of right now, 4 years post-pandemic, well, the US M2 money supply is actually very much on trend with where it would have been had we not gone through the pandemic. So even though it may not seem like there's been mitigating actions to reduce the money supply, the truth is, and this is the truth, there actually has. Now, that leads us into some counter arguments as to why the US dollar won't collapse. We already talked about the reserve currency status, and we also talked about other countries holding the dollar as their primary reserve. But here's the other big thing. In the absence of another currency that has the global confidence that the US dollar does, and by the way, there are no other currencies that have the same amount of confidence. The only one that's even close is the euro. The Chinese currency, at least not yet, is simply not as confidence inducing as the US dollar, primarily due to the fact that it is very, very hard to invest the Chinese currency. Well, that gives the US dollar a pretty big leg up on every other currency out there. And then on top of all that, the US just tends to have economic resilience. I mean, look at the fact that after World War II, the debt to GDP ratio was about the same as it is right now. And look at what happened in the 40 to 50 years afterwards. The debt to GDP ratio actually got to some of the lowest levels it's ever been. And there's a high likelihood that the US will find itself again at some point in time in a situation where the debt to GDP ratio is once again quite low. But that, of course, is only if US politicians get their act together. Now, there's multiple economic opinions with respect to how bad this crisis is. On the side that argues that a collapse is imminent, some economists argue that unchecked debt growth could eventually lead to a loss of confidence and a financial crisis. And yes, that is very much true. And that is why it is so important for US politicians to do everything that they can to restore confidence in the US economy by reducing the debt. But then there's also those opinions against the collapse. And I can't believe this just happened, but a fly literally just landed on my ear. And I caught it. Wow. Now, back to the video. So the arguments against the collapse are the fact that the US is in a unique position. And not only that the country has the ability to implement policies and to manage the debt should they so choose. And you don't have to look much further back than the Bush Sr. and the Clinton eras, where the debt was reduced significantly. And not only that, both presidents made significant inroads in reducing the deficit. And in fact, under Bill Clinton, there was a surplus when it came to the amount of money that the US government was spending. So it can, in fact, be done. The US can find itself in a situation where it is earning more than it is spending. And it is my belief that the US will once again find themselves in that situation as soon as the political appetite is actually there to do so. And the way in which that will be done is through multiple different reforms. So first is changing fiscal policies, efforts to reduce the deficit through spending cuts and tax reform. And then on top of that, there needs to be additional reforms to things like infrastructure investment, economic growth initiatives, and entitlement spending, which includes things like Social Security and healthcare. But the most important thing here is going to be the promotion of productivity in the US economy. This is what got the US out of World War II and the debt levels that we were in back then to where they were in the 80s and the 90s. And the reality is that the primary way to get out of the national debt is to create productivity booms. Look at the period from the end of World War II to the early 1970s, which was one of the greatest eras of economic expansion in world history. The gross domestic product increased from $228 billion in 1945 to just under $1.7 trillion in 1975. And by 1975, the US economy represented some 35% of the entire world's industrial output, making it 3 times larger than that of Japan, which was the next largest economy. But the major boom to productivity after World War II was the significant amount of factories that had been built to supply the war effort, which meant there was a whole bunch of additional capacity available at home to increase productivity to a level that brought the national debt down significantly. And while it may not seem like we're in that same sort of position today, the reality is we are. Because there's something that is transforming productivity as we know it. In fact, it is creating infinite human ability. And that is the evolution of AI and robotics. And what AI and robotics are doing and what they're going to do is increase capacity and productivity. and they are going to revolutionize various different industries. And when you think about the reality of AI and robotics, what we are doing is we are creating essentially infinite capacity. We're taking many of the jobs that require human input and finding ourselves in a position where we can double, triple, quadruple, even 1,000x that input, which might seem like it's going to reduce the number of available jobs. But in reality, what it's going to do is it is going to shift many of the jobs that require human input to AI and robotics, which will allow the people who are doing those jobs to do other things that require human input. And this is what will allow the US and the global economy to enter the next big productivity boom. And not only that, the increased productivity is going to reduce the cost of goods and services, making them more accessible and boosting consumption, which will lead to a circumstance where the quality of life for everyone, at least it should anyways, will get significantly better. And when you take a look at many of the estimates with respect to the future prospects of productivity growth, the numbers are staggering. In fact, in developed nations, AI growth is expected to increase labor productivity by 1.5%. And when you look at the estimated increases to global GDP, by the year 2030, AI could increase global GDP by up to 9.4%. And the expected GDP increases are even greater for countries like the US. So at the end of the day here, even though the US economy is in a situation where debt to GDP ratios are high, the next big wave of productivity is about to hit. And that combined with prudent practices by the government could lead us out of this debt crisis. But unfortunately, that's not guaranteed. So there are some things that you need to do to prepare yourself just in case things actually get worse. And the very first of those things is to understand that there is absolutely nothing that you can do to alter the course. There's nothing that you can do to prevent the crisis. There's nothing that you can do to affect the crisis. And all of the news media, all of the stuff on YouTube out there about the debt crisis and the US dollar collapse need to be considered noise, including things like this video. In fact, the only things that you have control of are the things that you actually control. So if you are in fact worried about a US dollar crisis, if you are in fact worried about the US debt crisis, then the things you need to focus on are your own personal economy. Things like getting out of debt, things like creating a diversified portfolio for your investment, and last but not least, understanding that those who ring the alarm bells the loudest about the coming financial crisis are usually the people that are trying to sell you something. So the very best thing that you can do is to just ignore the noise. Stop watching the US debt crisis videos. Stop watching the US dollar collapse videos. I mean, stop watching most of the stuff that is on my channel. Unless, of course, you actually want the truth about it. And the truth is, it's probably not as big of a deal as most people are making it out to be. Now, there are some things that perhaps you should be worried about. Things that are significantly more likely than a US national debt crisis that collapses the US dollar. And the primary one that I would suggest is the coming recession. Because here's the thing about a recession. I've called 10 of the last 2 recessions absolutely perfectly. But those other 8 times, I was nowhere close. And very rarely can somebody accurately predict a recession. In fact, most of the people who have a track record of predicting recessions were pretty much just always calling for a recession. But that doesn't mean that there isn't one coming, because there will be another recession. They happen every 3 to 5 years, like clockwork. And there are some surefire signs that you can look out for that pretty much always predict a recession. And if you want to know what they are, make sure you check out this video about what always happens right before a recession.